What happens when Joy Behar decides to challenge Morgan Freeman live on a daytime talk show, and the calmest voice in Hollywood responds in a way that makes the entire studio pause? Before we get into it, make sure to subscribe to Fame After Hours, and like and comment for more talk show coverage. The audience applauds as Morgan Freeman walks onto the set of The View. He smiles politely, nodding toward the crowd before taking his seat at the panel table. The hosts greet him warmly, clearly excited to have such an iconic guest on the show. Joy Behar leans forward slightly with a smile. Morgan Freeman is here today. Actor, director, narrator of what feels like half the documentaries on television. Honestly, that voice alone deserves an award. The audience laughs and claps. Morgan smiles softly. "Well, thank you. I appreciate that." Another host adds, "Morgan, you've had one of the most respected careers in Hollywood. Decades of incredible performances. What keeps you motivated after all these years?" Morgan folds his hands calmly on the table. "I enjoy the work. If you enjoy what you're doing, it doesn't feel like work." The audience nods and applauds lightly. Joy tilts her head thoughtfully. "You've also spoken a lot over the years about discipline and personal responsibility. You've said that people should focus on what they can control instead of blaming circumstances." Morgan nods slightly. "Yes, I believe that." Joy leans in a little closer. But some viewers push back on that idea. They say when celebrities talk about personal responsibility, it can feel disconnected from reality. A lot of people are dealing with challenges far beyond their control. A few murmurs ripple through the audience. Morgan remains calm. "That's a fair concern." Another host jumps in gently. What Joy's saying is that some viewers feel advice like that can sound oversimplified. Morgan nods thoughtfully. "I understand that perspective." Joy continues, clearly interested in pushing the discussion. "So let me ask you directly. When you talk about personal responsibility, do you think it applies equally to everyone? Because life doesn't give everyone the same starting point." The audience grows quiet. Morgan leans back slightly, taking a moment before responding. His voice remains calm and steady. "Life absolutely doesn't give everyone the same starting point. That much is obvious." Several audience members nod. "But," Morgan continues, "while we can't control where we start, we often can control how we respond to what happens next." Joy raises an eyebrow. "Often, but not always." Morgan smiles politely. "Of course not always. Life can be very unfair. But focusing only on what we cannot control can sometimes prevent people from moving forward." A few people clap softly. Joy leans forward again. "But isn't that easier to say once someone has already succeeded?" The room becomes noticeably quieter. Morgan looks at her calmly. "That's a reasonable question." Joy continues. "Because many viewers watching right now have worked hard their entire lives and never received the kind of opportunities that someone in Hollywood might get." Some audience members nod. Morgan listens carefully before responding. "Opportunity matters. Timing matters. Luck matters. I've never denied that." Joy nods slightly. "But effort matters too," Morgan adds calmly. The audience reacts with murmurs and light applause. Joy studies him for a moment, clearly intrigued. "So what exactly is the message you want people to take from that?" Morgan leans forward slightly. "People deserve honesty," he says. "Life is complicated. There are barriers, yes. But there is also strength in believing that your choices still matter." The audience begins clapping again, sensing that the conversation has only just begun to deepen. The audience applause fades, but the atmosphere at the table shifts slightly. Joy Behar leans forward again, clearly interested in pushing the conversation a little deeper. Across from her, Morgan Freeman sits relaxed, hands folded, listening carefully. Joy smiles, but there's a hint of challenge in her tone. "Morgan, I hear what you're saying about effort and responsibility, but many people would argue that success stories often leave out the advantages someone had along the way. Connections, opportunities, timing, things most people never get." A few audience members murmur in agreement. Morgan nods slowly. "That's true. Opportunities are not distributed equally." Another host jumps in gently. And that's something viewers talk about a lot. They see successful people and wonder if the system was ever really fair to begin with. Morgan turns slightly toward the host. The system isn't always fair. In fact, very often it isn't. The audience quiets again. Joy crosses her arms lightly. So then when people hear celebrities talk about hard work, they sometimes feel like it ignores that reality. Morgan takes a moment before answering. Hard work alone doesn't guarantee success. I've never claimed that it does. Joy tilts her head. That's interesting, because that's not always how people interpret those messages. Morgan smiles faintly. Messages get simplified. Reality is rarely simple. A few people in the audience laugh softly. Joy continues, clearly determined to press the point. Let me put it another way. If someone grows up in a difficult environment with limited opportunities, do you really believe the same principles apply to them as someone born into privilege? The room grows very quiet. Morgan leans slightly forward, speaking calmly. The circumstances are different. That's undeniable. But human potential isn't limited to circumstances alone. Joy raises an eyebrow. But circumstances shape outcomes, don't they? They influence them, Morgan replies. But they don't always determine them. A few audience members begin clapping softly. Joy glances toward the audience, then back at Morgan. Some critics would say that perspective places too much responsibility on individuals instead of acknowledging structural problems. Morgan nods thoughtfully. Acknowledging structural problems is important. Ignoring them would be dishonest. Another host nods in agreement. That's fair. Morgan continues, his voice steady. But telling people they have no power over their lives can also be harmful. People need hope. They need to believe their actions matter. The audience reacts with louder applause this time. Joy watches him closely. So your argument is that even if the system isn't fair, individuals still need to focus on what they can control? Morgan nods. Exactly. Joy leans back slightly, still studying him. But some people would say that kind of thinking lets institutions off the hook. Morgan smiles calmly. Holding institutions accountable and encouraging personal responsibility are not mutually exclusive. The audience murmurs, impressed by the balance in his response. Another host laughs lightly. That might be the calmest debate we've had at this table in a while. The audience laughs. Joy smiles too, but she isn't done yet. She leans forward again, clearly preparing to push the discussion even further. Well, Morgan, she says slowly, let me ask you something a little more direct. The studio quiets once more as everyone waits for the next question. The tension at the table has become noticeable now, the kind that happens when a conversation starts touching deeper issues. And Morgan Freeman, still calm and composed, looks ready for whatever question comes next. The studio becomes noticeably quieter as Joy Behar leans forward again, resting her hands on the table. Across from her, Morgan Freeman remains calm, watching her with a relaxed expression. The audience can sense the discussion has reached the point where the questions are about to become more direct. Joy takes a breath. All right, Morgan, let me ask you something plainly. When people hear successful figures talk about discipline and responsibility, some feel like those ideas ignore the bigger systems that shape people's lives. Do you think focusing on personal choices risks overlooking those realities? A few audience members murmur in agreement, while others wait quietly for Morgan's answer. Morgan nods slowly, considering the question. No, I don't think it ignores them, he says calmly. But I do think it changes where people put their energy. Joy tilts her head. Explain that. Morgan leans forward slightly, his tone still steady. If a person spends all their energy focusing on things they cannot change, they may never recognize the things they can. The audience grows very quiet. Joy watches him carefully. But some would argue that calling attention to unfair systems is necessary for progress. Morgan nods again. And they're right. Calling attention to injustice matters. It's how societies improve. Another host jumps in briefly. So you're saying both things can be true at the same time? Morgan smiles lightly. Exactly. Joy folds her arms loosely. But people often hear one message more loudly than the other. Morgan chuckles softly. That tends to happen in public conversations. A few people in the audience laugh. Joy presses on. So when someone says, "Just work harder," critics say that can sound dismissive of the barriers people face. Morgan shakes his head gently. I don't tell people to just work harder. That phrase oversimplifies everything. The audience murmurs again. What I say, Morgan continues, is that people deserve honesty. Life includes barriers, injustice, and inequality. But it also includes individual strength, resilience, and choices. Joy studies him closely. But do those choices really outweigh circumstances? Morgan pauses for a moment before answering. Sometimes they do, he says quietly. And sometimes they don't. But if people stop believing their choices matter, then circumstances will always win. The audience suddenly grows very still. Joy raises her eyebrows slightly. That's a strong statement. Morgan shrugs lightly. It's a realistic one. A few audience members begin clapping slowly. Another host looks toward the crowd. You can feel people thinking about that. The applause grows a little louder. Joy glances toward the audience, then back to Morgan. Her tone softens slightly now. You know, I expected this conversation to go in a very different direction. Morgan smiles. That happens sometimes. Joy laughs quietly. You're not getting defensive at all. Morgan chuckles. I've been around a long time. Conversations like this don't bother me. The audience laughs along with him. Joy shakes her head with a small smile. Well, I'll admit something. I thought you'd respond differently. Morgan raises an eyebrow slightly. How so? Joy gestures lightly toward him. I thought you might push back harder. Morgan leans back calmly in his chair. Oh, he says with a faint smile, I think I already did. The audience bursts into laughter and applause, the tension finally breaking as the conversation reaches its most memorable moment. The laughter in the studio slowly fades, but the energy in the room is different now. The audience is still smiling, some nodding as they look between Morgan Freeman and Joy Behar at the table on The View. Joy shakes her head slightly with a smile. All right, Morgan, I'll give you that one, she says, raising her hands playfully. You managed to answer every question without getting pulled into a full argument. The audience laughs again and applauds. Morgan smiles calmly. I prefer conversations to arguments. Another host leans in, clearly impressed. That might be one of the calmest yet most intense discussions we've had on this show. Joy nods in agreement. And I'll admit something, I thought this conversation was going to go in a very different direction. Morgan raises his eyebrows slightly. Sometimes the best conversations do. The audience claps once more as the hosts begin wrapping up the segment. Thank you for joining us today, one of the hosts says. This was a really thoughtful discussion. As the show moves on, the studio audience continues talking among themselves about the exchange they just witnessed. Some people are still nodding, clearly impressed by Morgan's calm responses. Later that day, clips from the conversation begin spreading quickly across social media platforms like YouTube, TikTok, and X, Twitter. Viewers debate the discussion in the comments. Some praise Morgan Freeman's calm and thoughtful answers, while others say Joy asked the tough questions many viewers were thinking. Either way, the moment quickly becomes one of the most talked-about segments from the show. Now we want to hear from you. Do you think Morgan Freeman completely shut down Joy Behar, or do you think Joy raised important questions during the discussion? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Fame After Hours for more real talk show stories.